Good morning, everyone. For all those that are joining us for our CEO call from our Roundtable series, on behalf of WBC, a warm welcome. Please feel free to use the chat and to share any comments you've got. Is Robert Reiss, Becky Shambaugh, and Jose Celestra will lead this call. And we're really thrilled to have three innovator CEOs that have been driving change as leaders, not only gender and diversity, but clearly purposeful and are driving companies of purpose. So welcome, welcome. And we'll wait another minute and we'll start in 60 seconds. Thank you so much to all those that have already joined us. Please feel free to announce yourself in the chat. Use the chat. We'll be monitoring your comments. This will be an hour-long call with three brilliant change leaders, CEOs, and this will be followed by an article in Forbes. We thank all of you for joining us and leading with us. Good morning. As you continue to join us, WBC welcomes you to our roundtable today with three change leader CEOs. We'll start in 30 seconds. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to WBC's CEO Roundtable. And how proud we are to see CEO leadership. As we say, the time is changing. The time is now for innovation and breakthrough leadership. We don't want to acknowledge many things, but one, let's share the new Leadership CEO magazine that Robert Reiss of the CEO Forum puts out. And it's all about the new ESG. And with us, that's all about gender and diversity. So Robert gets to 9,000 CEOs with that message. And we are just thrilled to be pushing purposeful leadership for both talent, whether it's suppliers, brands, and results in the community. We are really pleased to stop and celebrate Black History Month. And as Gwen Young and our team have been running events every several days and communications, we are just thrilled. And one of the partnership we formed during Women's History Month was with the New Bow Collective, 50 Black women entrepreneurs who have pooled their resources together to really drive collective action. But to all of our groups, let us just stop and realize everything we do in diversity to move the needle. And then let us recognize that Women's History Month will be historic. And all of us have so many events, whether it is the corporate world or whether it's the stock exchanges, to say, let's stop and look at where we are. And WBC, as you know, monitors every woman's CEO and a woman of color, the same in the C-suite. And with Equilar, Gwen Young and the team, today we're putting out the monthly report from January we continue to average about 43% women joining public boards for the last 13 months, but the women of color are growing. And we see dramatic changes on boards, and we see the word transparency. We're so pleased to announce a new partnership that was announced with Diligent, reaching out to 700,000 board members and CEOs for transparent board leadership. And with our entrepreneurship and capital, we have a new partnership with Seneca and Bank of America to put up all that's happening in new capital. So we've got announcement after announcement, but today let's focus on the 3 CEOs that are helping to drive the new corporate America. So we'll turn this over to Robert and Becky Shambaugh, and we will have the summary by Jose, Celestra, and so proud that all 3 of you are on WBC's board of directors.
Thank you, Edie. Hello, everybody. I'm Becky Shambaugh. Edie, thank you for your inspiring message and great leadership with WBC. It's an honor to be part of the board of directors for WBC and be joined by Robert Reiss and Jose Zeilstra as my colleagues on the board of directors as well. We have a great roundtable today. We are so grateful to have 3, as Edie said, unbelievable CEOs who have really carved a path in the past years in terms of creating more equitable and inclusive organizations. But they're continuing to do that. And so I'm happy to do a brief introduction because we'll learn a lot more of them in our interviews. Is Aileen Alexander, who is the CEO of Diversified Search Group. If you know Aileen or have checked her out, she's one of the most respectful and influential executives in the executive search world, if you will. So welcome, Aileen. I will say one notable thing here that she is one of 2 women who are CEOs in the top 10 executive search areas. So welcome, Aileen. Nice to have you here. Dan Hesse is actually the CEO of Akamai and technology company. And you may know Dan from his prior years as the prior chief executive officer of Sprint. Notable, he actually came into Sprint when it was almost close to bankruptcy and turned that around to be a high-performing organization. Welcome, Dan, and we're eager to learn more about some of the great things that you've done for women, for equity, and what you're doing now for the organization and society around gender and equity. And our third guest is Maria Colacurcio. I hope I got that right, Colacurcio. Maria, wonderful to have you here. You know, when I met you and I think of you as a major disruptor in today's times to really get to the core of what it's going to take to achieve equity for all, particularly in gender equity and equitable opportunities. Maria is the CEO of Syndio Solutions and is clearly having a differentiating impact in the marketplace for gender equity and pay parity. So welcome, Maria. Thank you all. So let's get started. As Edie said, Robert and I are going to help facilitate these informal kind of dialogue questions with the CEOs, and then Jose Celestra will be a wrap up and gets the hardest job, kind of pull out all the pearls of wisdom and come up with a summary of all the great messages that the CEOs have sent to us today. So Aileen, I'd like to start off with you. As I mentioned to everyone, you're the CEO of Diversified Search Group, and you're the only woman one of the 2 women actually, that in the top 10 executive search industries that has become a CEO. Now, I know that you probably advise a lot of women, advancing onto boards, into the C-suite and such, but we have a lot of individuals, women and men on this in this conference today that would love to hear any advice, guidance that you have that you've learned along your journey to achieve just exceptional opportunities and roles now with Diversified Search as a CEO.
Sure. Well, Well, thanks for the question, Becky, and just want to acknowledge Edie and just her leadership. Like Edie, you talked about moving the needle. It's all about data, and I'm a data geek. So Edie, thank you for always bringing the facts forward as we make progress and inviting me into today's conversation. Becky, just a bit on Diversified Search Group. As you mentioned, I'm one of two women CEOs, but I joined a firm that was founded nearly 50 years ago by Judy von Zeldenik, who is now our chair, but as you know, has been a pioneer and a trailblazer in our industry and really focused on a purpose, and that purpose being diversifying the C-suite across multiple sectors and industries and having impact. And what I can share with you when you look at the evolution that we're in the last couple of years is our firm and our track record is seeing tremendous growth. Just last year, we grew 50% all organic, which is reflecting the demand for new leadership, but also that emphasis on diversity and bringing diverse, equitable, and inclusive leaders to the forefront who can drive transformation and innovation and growth. So just a lot there and a lot happening. Before we got started, we were talking a bit about my background, and I'm going to reflect on that with you all as I saw some of the members here. I think we're in a moment in terms of leadership where having collective, unique experiences are at the forefront. Myself, I haven't been in the search industry my entire career. It's been just the past 12 years. I actually started in the military, where I learned people first, mission always leadership, and then worked in public policy. And when you step back and you look what's happening in companies and organizations today, I think having a collection of experience sets can be across sectors, it can be across functions, is in the highest demand as we see this intersection of business and society. And so I think we're in a moment where there's not just one path or one model to follow, but that there can be uniqueness within one's experiences. And that can take you into the C-suite as well as the CEO role.
So really that collective reach of experiences, skills, competencies, I think really helps to position you. I admire you for taking on this role, because you haven't done it before, but I think that's a real important message, isn't it? That take the stretch, right? Believe in yourself and surround yourself with those great people. Well, thank you for that. And by the way, thank you for Diversified Search for being one of our being our founding sponsor for WBC when we first jump-started WBC. So we want to, on behalf of all of us, thank Diversified Search Group for being such a great partner. So Robert, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks. So Aileen, you're in a sense in a rare position because you're a harbinger of what is to come. By doing search, you see all of the trends, and you also place the senior executives who are driving forth corporations. So what do you really see as the core trends, and how do you see that impacting gender equity?
Mm-hmm. Well, Robert, as you know, there's been a lot written around new leadership, and particularly coming through the pandemic. And one trend we're seeing is what Becky just mentioned, those leadership experiences and competencies that are increasingly being sought. And so as we look at our CEO, what we call success profiles or other C-suite roles, is again bringing the diversity in terms of breadth of experiences that is coming at a forefront. We are seeing increasing interest in those that bring breadth in terms of their networks, particularly as you think about multiple stakeholders and stakeholder engagement, from shareholders to employees to local communities. We're seeing a lot of demand around one's ability to be adaptable, as well as resilient. So that is increasingly sought. Leadership with empathy and compassion, and to a certain degree, vulnerability is also there. And again, can't understate that the focus on, I think it was said well here at the beginning, around building inclusive cultures that foster diversity and equity in a sustainable and in an impact way is also being sought.
That's great. So really, Aileen, what you're talking about is a completely new leadership model that's very different than the past. And again, I commend you on Diversified Search really being the pioneers. You were the first ones to do this. So that's great. Becky, back to you.
Great. Thank you, Robert. You know, I'm hearing this is a pivotal time to change the lens of leadership. And so, Aileen, I'm sure you counsel with a lot of executives, organizations, and helping them to make that shift. But you think this would be easier. But what do you think is the fundamental thing that organizations and boards need to do in this dynamic time to really lean more into and achieve gender balance, equity for all, gender parity? Mm-hmm. I know that's a big question, but anything top of mind today?
They have to walk the walk. They have to be intentional. They have to measure how they're doing. You look at the WBC report in October of 2021, which is so the progress, which we tend to look at the statistical progress, but we also know there's more to be done. So there needs to be intention there, and there needs to be a focus on results. I think organizations also really need to look internally in terms of how they're developing critical mass and pipeline and affording pipeline opportunities. We all know there's a gap as you're coming up the ranks to then really leap into for women in terms of those opportunities to get to those senior roles. So that needs to be a priority. There also needs to be intention around succession planning and how mentorship and sponsorship fall into that. And I'm a big believer. I've had men as mentors and sponsors as well as women, and so we all need to be doing our part on that front.
Really seeing it as our role, right? It's not showing up and getting things done, but it really is our role to grow talent, particularly from within. So critical. Thank you, Aileen. And now we're going to hear from Dan Hesse. Robert, I'm going to turn it over to you for the first question with Dan.
Thanks, Becky. So Dan, I want to start with when you became CEO of Sprint, and let's do like that before and after picture, because it really was tough. And then you did something that no one was talking about in those days called ESG. Now everyone's talking about it, but you pioneered that, and the financial results you achieved, as well as the cultural and society results, are not paralleled by many people in the entire history of corporations. You should read about the turnaround, but talk about that turnaround before and after, and the role of ESG.
Well, you're kind for that question, Robert. I appreciate it. Good to see you, and good to see everybody on the call. So when I got to Sprint, first hour on the job, I was given a binder, which was the business plan, and the plan of record had us filing for bankruptcy in 6 months. So there was certainly a sense of urgency. And if you really look at the root cause of why Sprint was in the problem it was not only did it not have a culture, but it had two competing cultures, because it had been, in essence, the company was Sprint Nextel. There had been a recent merger, a merger of equals between Sprint and Nextel. So I knew right away that we needed to build a culture. And I engaged the employees of the company in creating and defining the culture, those attributes of the company that they thought would be successful and the company they wanted to work for. And I think most successful cultures, if you take a look at the companies that really have strong, successful cultures, those cultures are founded on customers, employees, and some sense of purpose. So the culture that resulted from, we'll call it this input from our people, this was, 14, 15 years ago, really had the anchors or the same principles that you see today in ESG. So we had this ESG driven culture a long time before, ESG issues were, were at the forefront. And culture really created that common bond language to get things done, and really that boost in morale. So on the E side, we decided to focus on the environment and all the things we could do in our company. I read this article that you could take a line of dump trucks from Washington, D.C. to Orlando full of e-waste. And that's what was, being thrown out every year. And the leading contributor were cell phones. Because back then, people just got new cell phones and just threw them out. So we really focused on phone recycling, manufacture and reuse, reducing water, paper, power usage. And we were, recognized kind of uniquely in the industry for what we did, in the area of energy. And as you know, Robert, I would get some grief sometimes from shareholders spending so much time on what's this green stuff? What does that have to do with this quarter's profits? On the social side, I mentioned the culture of, kind of employees and people, and that's a virtuous cycle. You treat your people well, they treat customers well. Customers can see that, and they like dealing with the company. And then, of course, as customers are being served well, your employees are happier. So it's this, if you will, this virtuous cycle. And we really focused on simplicity, taking away all the pain points that customers felt, so that the interactions between employees and customers were pretty positive. Things like, the first unlimited plans. The other thing we did is, we had a really good technology team, and we said, how can we apply mobile technology to serve our customers with special needs? So we created all these products, for example, with text to speech and speech to text for people who are either sight impaired or hard of hearing, products for the autistic, and we were recognized by the autism community for things we would do like that. Made our people feel kind of very good, or on the kind of those S issues. And finally, on the G side, privacy. Again, way back when, we decided that this privacy thing's getting out of hand. You get targeted advertising, and for some people it was creepy. And what wireless carriers and really all internet companies did back then is, if you didn't want your data to be used for advertising and other purposes, you had to opt out. We were the only company that said, okay, Sprint customers, we're not going to use any of your data. And this cost us millions of dollars, because advertisers will pay a lot more for targeted data. We're going to have our customers opt in. It was an issue of trust. So, we really did focus a lot on ESG. Kind of, and at the end of the day, if you take a look at kind of those key stakeholders or pillars of culture, 20 GDPs from last to first in the American Customer Satisfaction Index. As a matter of fact, we're recognized by them as the most improved U.S. company across all 43 industries, period, in overall customer satisfaction. On the purpose side, we saw it reflected in our brand. The Reputation Institute measures overall corporate reputation of the 1,500 largest companies in the world, and they recognize Sprint for the most improved overall corporate reputation of any company in the world of those 1,500. And last, this is getting back to my earlier comment about getting, a hard time from investors. They started to cut us a break, because in my last 2 calendar years, Sprint's total shareholder return ranked #1 among all 500 companies that make up the S&P 500 index, ahead of #2 Netflix. So what that really shows is ESG is good business. ESG principles make sense, and you're not, if you will, not serving shareholders well by also serving all of your other stakeholders well.
Well, congratulations on that, Dan. It's great. He also, by the way, was telling me his 2 sons, they had a survey. They said the top phone executives in the world, and Steve Jobs was #2 and Dan was #1 ahead of him. First time, right? Your sons are like, hey, Dan, That's cool, Dad, right?
Yeah, I think it was the first compliment I ever got from either son. Yes.
So let's shift over. You were on the board of Just Capital. Talk about its purpose, the role it's played in gender parity.
Sure. So Just Capital, if you're not familiar with it, is a nonprofit, and it was started years ago when it was felt that capitalism's popularity was declining, and this was an organization founded by capitalists and saying we need to fix capitalism or improve it, or capitalism as our economic system may not be around. So we surveyed the American people of what behavior do you want to see from American companies in terms of the companies that you buy products from, go to work for, or invest in. And what came back in the surveys is, not surprisingly, they want to see companies that serve all stakeholders well. The customers, communities, the planet, shareholders, of course, but most important, number one, and by the way, this has increased every year, how they treat their employees. They want to buy from companies that treat their people really well. And the two issues that come forward that are the most important are, number one, pay and benefits, especially to frontline or entry workers. What in COVID we call essential workers almost. They want to see good pay and benefits to everyone, and also gender and racial pay equity. Those are the two things they want to see. So what we try to do in Just is we go get this data, we provide it to everyone, the American people, and we don't, kind of like J.D. Power, we don't, if you will, diss or criticize companies that don't do these things. We recognize those that do well, hoping that will lift, if you will, all boats. So, for example, we want all companies to do a gender pay equity analysis. Unfortunately, a year ago, only 14% of companies report that they do them. Some companies will do them and not report, but only 14% of companies do. So we want to see that number go up. So we have kind of a gender equity scorecard at Just Capital. Number one is, do they do a gender equity pay analysis? Number two, are a third of your board members or more female? Do you give 12 or more weeks of paid parental leave? Do you have backup dependent care, et cetera? So a year ago, only 5 of the roughly 950 companies that we evaluate scored a plus on all of those metrics. The good news is, a year later, 27 did. So, that's a more than a 5-fold increase. So we think by recognizing the companies that really focus on these issues, that we're making a difference.
Thank you, Dan. Becky, all yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Robert. Dan, thank you so much. And, pioneering the ESG, and look how that's evolved for so many others. In the conversation to build upon that around gender equity, women, those of diversity, you've been a big advocate for that. And, the last 2 years, I think we've learned a lot. We've seen a lot in terms of this great resignation and a fallout of a number of very talented women. So we'd love to hear from you. Listen, how can we mitigate that going forward? What have we learned, and how can organizations and constituencies try to mitigate the loss of so many talented women in the workforce?
Well, that's a great question, Becky. You're right. The studies show that men are returning to work post-pandemic at a much higher rate than women are. And actually, this is even exacerbated when you look at women of color. They're returning at a rate even lower. The issues seem to be, from what we can determine, are largely related to child and dependent care, which is logical. And also buried in the stats when they say return to work, a lot of companies, like ones that I'm involved in, provide workers with the option of coming into the office or working remotely. So if I opt to work remotely, that counts in I'm returning to work. And as those of us who have been on Zoom calls or conference calls where everybody's in a conference room, but I'm remote, it's easy to be either ignored or not have as much of an impact. So there's an unintended bias, we'll call it, against people who are working remotely. And we want to make sure that we guard against that. So in terms of what can be done, number one, is around pay and benefits, which I mentioned briefly earlier, to take a look at all those parental issues and make sure that those are not the impediments for people, coming back to work. Number two is I listened to a talk at the Business Council last week by Deanna Mulligan. She's the retired CEO of Guardian Life. And they did a study of people who aren't returning back to work. And one of the things that sticks out is that people are much more likely to say that, I don't feel as welcome. I don't feel a part of that company. So these equity issues, making sure, so people don't think they're part of a club, that the company's a club that I don't belong to, is crucial. The other is this notion of purpose. Is there a reason I come to work that's more than just a paycheck? That gets me to want to come back, into the workforce because I'm doing something good. Last is, is this issue that, I was just hitting on earlier, and that is that boards and management need to lean in to this issue of those that are working remotely, making sure that they're not being disadvantaged when it comes to new opportunities or promotions. I mean, when I grew up, in my career, remember my boss kept saying, well, you've got to go to headquarters because you need visibility. People need to see you, you need to be there. And it's pretty easy when you're working remotely, I think, to perhaps be forgotten. And we need to continue to make progress, especially in the executive ranks and management ranks, of having it be more diverse. So we might need to lean into that. And last, I think it was an issue that Aileen mentioned, is in terms of bringing people back to work, we need to look at what kind of leaders we want running companies, that the barriers to exit are basically gone for companies, not only not coming to work, but to go to work for somebody else, because it used to be so geographically defined. I mean, I knew a company in a particular city. It was the big company, and the CEO was, quite frankly, a real jerk. And but people couldn't leave because their spouses worked in that city or their kids went to school there. Now, if you don't treat people with empathy and caring and inspiration, not only will your people maybe not come to work, but they'll go work for somebody else. So retention becomes a much bigger issue. So what was mentioned earlier, kind of a new kind of leader, I think in the pandemic, post-pandemic, is going to be needed. And quite frankly, when oversimplifying, you might say soft skills are more important. Soft skills, based upon my own career and having, I grew up in a household where it was me and my dad against the six women. But so I know, women tend to excel in soft skills. So I think the future is very bright for seeing more female CEOs and senior leaders.
Thank you, Dan. I think you said that so well. And all of us here on this kind of listening to you, I think echo, and it just speaks volumes to the new lens of leadership. And we can't go back. We're not going back. And so those soft skills, I think, become very hard skills and very important skills. So thank you so much for that. So Maria, welcome. And wow, just so much to talk about there with you. I wanted to I'm just so fascinated. We're all fascinated around Syndio and what you're doing. Tell us why you started it, your vision for it, and what was the real problem you were trying to solve?
Yeah, and thank you so much, first of all, for having me. And Dan, that it was fascinating to hear you speak, because we are talking so much now about ESG, and the conversation has moved to the S, the social, the human capital part of ESG. And I think leaders are really struggling to figure out, even those progressive leaders, it's elusive, and they're trying to figure out, how can I do right by my people? I know I have to invest in these things, but diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, as someone said in the chat, has become sort of this amorphous idea that no one can quite get their arms around. And that's because it hasn't been actionable. So if you think about what we're doing at Syndio, we're a workplace equity platform. So we started out doing pay equity. So moving from the way companies have traditionally done this is to outsource it to a law firm, which takes months and months. It's very cumbersome and costly. And the issue that I saw was that companies weren't learning anything about why those gaps existed in the first place. So they were just remediating over and over again, year after year, and doing these static once a year audits. So what we started doing was using technology and innovation to create a platform that would measure, achieve, and sustain all facets of workplace equity. And we started with pay equity. So we have about 200 clients, 10% of the Fortune 200, big names using our software to not only get rid of pay inequity because of gender, race, ethnicity. You can look at anything that you have in your data, but also start to prevent it. And from there, we expanded into what I've heard many of you talk about today, which is how do you unlock opportunity? How do you make sure once you're not paying unfairly because of gender, race, or ethnicity, how do you then make sure that you're promoting people fairly, that you're analyzing where promotion opportunities are? And it's not just that, it's not level. The other piece of this are groupings in terms of function. So if you think about systemic bias, women, people of color tend to be in the lower paid functions like HR, marketing. And so even as they rise up the ranks of a company, they're still in those lower paid functions. So how do you identify that and give people opportunity to get new skills, to reskill, to move functions, and to get those opportunities that others may have had that came before them? And so that's what we do when you use technology and data to do it.
Yeah, sounds like you're really getting to the core versus the metrics, the numbers. We can fix those really quick and tweak them, but a year later, we're right back where we started, right?
Exactly.
So I have to ask you though, again, we're talking to Aileen, you think it'd be so simple to change the demographics on boards and organizations, but it hasn't been yet. But what do you see as the biggest underlying problem? Because I would imagine your platform of systems and offerings have really addressed that.
Yeah, so I think there's two sides to it, and you speak to one, all of you, really eloquently in terms of how do you get people the opportunities to move up? And there are some of these factors that are systemic and that are of choice and all of those things. And like, as Dan said so beautifully earlier, you have to provide people with the tools and opportunities they need to take on that next step. And so for a lot of women and people of color right now, that tool is flexibility. And so we as leaders can offer that. And so I think it's really important to think about meeting people where they're at and making sure that we're extending those opportunities and we're identifying as a company and as leaders what our accountability is to make sure people are valued for what they're bringing to the table. So I think the other thing that is really important for CEOs, as we sit down with our executive leadership team and we look around the table and we think about, how am I valuing my leadership team? Even think about the last 2 years. So I talk to a lot of CEOs who are looking at market pay bands, and they're very frustrated because if you just use market pay, it is very, very broken. And so if you think about HR, again, HR is a function filled with women and people of color. And so if you're just going off a market range, those executives, even at the C level, are going to be paid much less. So what I always encourage CEOs to do is to look around the table and say, what are the strategic and non-financial initiatives and objectives that this leader is tasked with right now? And in the past 18 months, I mean, CHROs have absolutely upended and done so much work to bring our companies remote, to make sure people are still productive, to make sure they're engaged. There's now wellness and mental health. They're dealing with all these topics, yet we still pay them like a third-rate exec. So we've got to start thinking about that. We've got to make sure that we're using data to first solve pay inequity. Like if you still have pay gaps that are because of gender, race, or ethnicity, or you don't know, or you're not analyzing it, you've got to start there, because employees are starting to demand transparency around these topics. And I think that call for transparency is going to continue.
I think this is the year for transparency, right? And even legislation popping up to make that happen. So I'm going to turn it over to Robert now for one more question, Maria, for you, and then we'll get into the roundtable discussion. So Robert?
Thank you, Becky. So Maria, what you've done is tremendous in terms of data. And just like Aileen, who is a self-proclaimed data geek, you've done something I think is really cool with your 501c3 with Fair Pay Workplace. Just talk about the concept and what you're accomplishing there.
Yeah, of course. So what we saw happening, we're a software company and our clients use our software to create a more equitable workplace. And they do that by looking at the data. And what we saw happening was our customers were coming to us every equal pay season. And they were so frustrated because they were using equitable pay and pay equity as a competitive advantage for hiring, for retaining their people, using it very much in the ways that Dan was talking about, creating a culture and a value structure within their company. And they saw all their competitors coming out around Equal Pay Day saying, we're dollar for dollar pay equity and we pay the same, and basically competing with them on this construct of pay equity, yet not using the right methodology. And so we said, okay, how do we solve this? How do we create a separate nonprofit organization that literally is the clearinghouse, the certification to ensure that companies are doing this correctly? They're using the right methodology. They're not gerrymandering the data. There's a lot of ways that you can mess with your pay equity if you're doing it under privilege or under lock and key or in a secret room that make you look really good, but you're excluding a ton of roles. You're not disclosing how much you're excluding. You're disaggregating. So everyone's a very, very special snowflake. So no one can be compared. If you and I are doing the same job, but your job's a little different, you could make the argument that, well, there's no female comparator then because our jobs are different. And so how can we create a structure that's a separate, credible organization that certifies companies are doing this well, using the right standards and tools? So we set up Fair Pay Workplace, and they've now certified a bunch of companies like American Airlines, Selling Construction, Databricks, and basically given them that stamp of approval that they can now use to say, not only are we doing pay equity in an ongoing way, we're doing it in a certified way that's above board and follows a precise set of standards and tools.
And I commend you on creating something so significant. Back to you, Becky.
Okay, well, thank you. And now let's lean into more of a roundtable conversation. And it's really a two-part question for all of you. Anybody can jump in first. And it's given that we've everything we've talked about today, what is the one thing that organizations can do now, coming off of a post-pandemic, sort of a new era, if you will, to really fully and better engage all their talent, including women? And how can we as an organization, as all of us, Maria, Dan, and Aileen, become more of that purposeful, driven organization? So I'll let someone jump in and provide the first answer. Dan, you want to go for? Dan, you want to jump in?
Sure. Although my video is shut off, but that's all right. You're not missing anything.
We still see your
go.
picture. There you are. There you are.
Well, I talked about this a little bit before, but I'd say a couple things, and why this is so important is, first of all, I think remote work is going to be permanent. I think, and that needs just a brand new lens. So this is not something that's going to go away in 6 months or 18 months or 2 years. And second is that the demand for people is going to exceed the supply for some time to come, which puts, kind of an exclamation point on, we'll call it these soft skills and what have you, that we described earlier. And listening to Maria's points, what I thought about is, boy, why the Chief Human Resource Officer is so often female. And why is that? And as we think about succession, how rare it is that the Chief Human Resource Officer is considered that stepping stone to the CEO job. It's something else. And I think as we think of career pathing, that assignments in human resources and what have you should become more part of the mainstream of developing the senior leaders of the company, so they understand these people issues. They understand talent acquisition, talent retention, morale, and what have you. I think the other things that are very important, and I'm looking at this from the perspective as, let's say, a director, is that we ought to demand, and actually, all companies should be able to articulate their mission and their purpose and their culture, and also measure the culture. That's one of the things that we did at Sprint, is every quarter, along with our financial metrics, we had the elements that defined our culture, and we would survey the people. How are we doing at walking the talk on each of those? And then either be going up or down. And actually, one of the elements of our culture was have fun. And, that was always the lowest rated item on there, but it started to improve because I started having these parties, these beer parties, after work. People were only allowed one beer. but people loved them. And then when the scores got better, I stopped having them, and people go, oh, we need to send them a message. So the scores went down. So I brought them back, those kinds of things. But I think if I think measuring the culture and letting people participate in the measurement of that culture is also, extremely important. And, kind of finally, I think the boards, as they look at their scorecard, we always look at the financial metrics and other key metrics, really need to start looking at these, we'll call it employee satisfaction metrics, because you have some key lead indicators that we found over the years with respect to people leaving the company. The most important was the employee net promoter score. And that question is, would you recommend our company as a place to work for your friends and family? That was the most important indicator, period, of how people really felt about the company. And when that thing starts going down, everything else starts going down. And that when things moving up, going forward, it was the best predictor of success of all the metrics that we had. So I think just a new set of metrics rising to the top of what we look at.
That's great. I love that last question of, could you recommend other people anywhere, any place you go, anybody you talk to the company? Wow, that's a great marker. Thank you, Dan. All right. Aileen, would you like to go next?
Yeah, no, sure. And I'll just, Dan and Maria were so eloquent in their points earlier on this front, but just reemphasizing, I think they're, coming through the pandemic, right? There's no turning back. And we do need to be looking out, looking forward. And I think accepting that we are going to have a remote working population and being really intentional on how you foster not just inclusivity, but belonging, that sense of belonging. So having that intentionality. The second, and Dan said this earlier, but is, and Maria, I believe, emphasized it as well, is connecting at an individual level one's purpose to the greater purpose of the organization. And the third is really how we model as leaders, right? Becky, you mentioned we're in this transparency moment, right? And I think the leadership teams, leadership teams in general need to embody how they're realizing the values, how they're practicing transparency and creating an environment of trust and accountability. So those would be what I would highlight.
Wonderful. So key. All key elements for creating that new path forward. Thank you, Aileen. Maria.
Yeah, I mean, I echo what everyone is saying, and it's so important. And I think you touched on it earlier around transparency. Like, transparency is not going away. So we just saw New York City enact the pay transparency law, which insists that all job postings have salary ranges. That's already happened in Colorado. It's happened in Nevada. And I think more regulation and compliance and laws like that are coming. I think what's going to happen is, Western Europe for a long time has had median pay gap disclosure, which is, you've got to, all companies over 100 have to disclose their median pay gap, which is your average, which reflects, are all your men up here and all your women down here. We've had laws that are very strong around pay equity, which is equal work for equal pay. What I see happening is we're each influencing each other. So pay equity is moving over to Western Europe, which you saw, a couple of weeks ago with the BNP Paribas bank settlement case. It was the first case where part of the remedy was the bank actually had to go do an audit of their pay. And that's the first time we've seen in Western Europe this push toward pay equity. And I think similarly, the pay gap and median pay is coming here, which means we have to really start looking at how are we providing that upskilling and reskilling and moving people, promoting people in our organizations. And I think it's just going to get stronger in terms of the transparency requirements, both on the salary range side, which is really a reflection for employees, right? They can see, am I falling behind based on what you're paying a new person that's doing my job? And then also on the compliance regulation side, I think in general, we're going to start seeing movements to not just board diversity, but leadership team diversity. How is that working throughout your entire company? What's your overall gap? And we've seen it, from the activist investors, but I think it's moving. I think we're going to start seeing it from folks like BlackRock and Fidelity and State Street. I think we're going to see it from the SEC and most importantly, and the population from whom leaders cannot hide. We're going to continue seeing it from our people.
Thank you, Maria. I feel like with all of your three visions for the future, and it just feels like this is the moment in time where we are going to begin to see some real shifts. And I think as we've learned, it's culture, but I also think it's leadership, right? And I feel like the whole conversation today is really disrupting and changing the lens of leadership. So we thank all of you for your time and not just being a role model, but your inspirational ideas and perspective, but also your practical solutions and things that we can do, each and every one of us today on this call to move the needle forward for better organizations that really foster greater inclusion and gender parity and just a human leadership touch. So thank you all, and we wish you the best in your journey as you continue to move the needle and do great things. So now I want to turn it over to our partner in crime, Jose Celestra, who will capture the key nuggets of so many great things today for a follow-up. Jose?
Thank you, Becky, and thank you, Robert, for facilitating this discussion, and thank you to the panelists for some awesome material. Probably too much to go through, but I will try and summarize, starting with some great advice on, moving up to the C-suite and CEO level. And, based on Aileen's experience that's so broad and diverse, I think having much more cross-sectional and functional experience is important, and not that there's a single career path or model that you have to follow, that there's a lot more different types of paths that get to the C-suite that companies are drawing on. And also some of the trends that we heard that are impacting gender equality based on her view at Diversified Search. And, some of the things that she shared with us is that there's really, as I mentioned, a new leadership model with different skills and competencies and backgrounds. And that it's important to have diversity in terms of breadth of experience and also your networks. Leaders that are adaptable and resilient. I also heard many times over, it's important for leaders to be empathetic and compassionate and vulnerable and creating those inclusive cultures of belonging. And in order to increase diversity, leaders need to really walk the talk, to be very intentional, focus on results, and really drive mentoring and sponsorship through the organizations. And then when it came to Dan, we learned a lot about his experience at Sprint, and he was really a forward-thinking leader on the importance of ESGs, even before it was called that, and really needing to build strong cultures around the customer, around employees, and that sense of purpose that we hear more about today. And applying, that he applied a mobile technology to serve customers, especially those with special needs around sight and hearing and autism, and really, supporting that community. I also found Dan's advice on the impact of the Great Resignation on the retention of women in the workplace, especially women of color in the workplace, really important. And some of the issues that we see around women leaving the workplace because of child independent care, and that this hybrid remote work model is not necessarily conducive to them being connected to the organization that's gone back into the workplace, and that there's unintended bias there. Lots of solutions that we can apply, and including parental leave and support, and that not creating a club that people can't belong to, and that sense of purpose, and leaning in to those that are working remotely to make sure that they feel that they belong. Again, leaders running companies need to treat employees with empathy and caring, those soft skills that have been traditionally attributed to women, that all leaders need to apply. And then from Maria, Syndio, a company that's so innovative in solving the pay equity and other workplace problems through their technology, and very innovative ways to get rid of this inequity, but also to prevent it in the first place. and looking at making sure that companies promote people fairly, removing those biases, and giving opportunities to identify those skills for people in underrepresented groups that they need to adapt to in order to succeed. Some of the best practice companies show, the focus is on, the strategic and financial piece, and paying people accordingly, and using data to solve the pay inequity problem. And the importance that we heard time and time again is transparency, and making sure that companies use the right standards and tools, not gerrymandering, especially when it comes to pay in the workplace. So lots of great recommendations there. And in terms of the vision for the future, some of the attributes of purpose-driven organizations, Dan shared again that, remote work is going to be permanent, and leaders will need to really adapt to that and make sure that they bring in and lean into those organizations and people that are working remote. Because demand will continue to exceed supply. And again, there's not one, career path, and that's the CHRO could be a stepping stone to the CEO as well. And that boards, need to look at employee satisfaction surveys. I think that's really important. And that's question around, would you recommend your organization as a place to work for, to family and friends, and the importance of that question in terms of the culture in the organization. And from Aileen, again, fostering belonging in a remote work environment, connecting the individual purpose to the greater purpose of the organization, and creating an environment of trust. And lastly, Maria, again, transparency, not just around salary, but also on board and leadership diversity. And because we know more regulations and laws are coming, so it's good to get ahead of that, especially when it comes to the pay gap and the median pay, and making sure that companies focus on upskilling and reskilling their people. So lots of great advice. And now I'm going to turn it over to Edie to give her final words.
Thank you, Jose and Becky and Robert, Maria and Aileen, and clearly Dan. You just changed leaders, and we can't do this without you, without the transparency. And when you think about the examples of Syndio and Just Capital, and clearly what you're doing to provide systematic change, we just endorse you as change leaders. But we want to really focus on what that means to all companies of purpose, to the new belonging. And clearly, it's the first time that we're hearing that there are chief trust officers and chief culture officers being named within companies to really ensure that we are driving that change with systems. And for publishing the data, as you're doing at Syndio and as you're doing with Just Capital, and we add gender fair to that. Because as you've taught us, Jose, with 96 ratings that you've given to Verizon and Procter & Gamble, we are going to shine that light on the scores of the companies of change. And Syndio said it, and Just Capital, what we have to do is show by leadership examples. So WBC is grateful to your leadership. We have kicked off this Companies of Purpose, and we encourage all of you to join us. We are building together against the 9 initiatives. We are grateful to Aileen, Maria, and gosh, Dan, of seeing you're there as a male ally is extraordinary. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maria.
Thank you.
Okay, we can't wait to work with you.